About corporate social responsibility the week before the last, and so I'm putting up this short video, and I'll of course put up the slides to discuss this a bit and to just get a sense of what we mean when we talk about this and why this is important for firms. So there's a few things that I'm gonna be talking about in this video, which is basically first, what do we mean by CSR? What is it? A couple of examples and types of corporate social responsibility. How do we measure its effectiveness? Once we know what it is, then we can actually talk about measuring effectiveness, problems and challenges, and eventually at the end, of course, a couple of remarks about this. So first of all, what is CSR? So this is the kind of longish definition. So it's self-regulating business models that helps a company be socially accountable to itself, stakeholders, and the public. Companies can be conscious of the kind of impact they have on all aspects of society. So there's a few words here that are interesting or important. First, it's self-regulating, meaning that the companies basically try to be socially responsible because they want to. There's no law forcing them to do it, and it's their own choice. So in this sense, it's what we mean by self-regulating. And of course, in this sense, the highlight words are socially accountable because they want to be responsible in social terms in this sense. Other keywords is itself, stakeholders, and the public. So it's some behavior, some set of decisions that actually reflect the company's on itself. So it's done for the workers, for the consumers, for the shareholders, and for the public, right? So it has an impact in many different dimensions and many different things that the company may want to be proactive on can be very different, and we're going to see quite a few examples in this video. And it could be like economic, they could be social, they could have the goal of addressing environmental issues. So many different aspects, but most of them, or all of them basically, and trying to be socially responsible at the end. I guess probably one of the most important questions is, why do we care? Or even better, why do companies care? Because if you look at any company 50 or more years ago, they wouldn't really be talking about corporate social responsibility. Sadly enough, many companies now, they still don't do it. But back in the day, very few did it. So it's something that sort of appeared in the 90s, at the turn of the century. And it has to do with the fact that it basically came off when societies became sort of post-industrialized. So it's very hard to actually tell the exact point in which companies started to care about these things, but it's mostly when societies, or when economically developed societies had enough welfare or well-being that they could deal with other things rather than just surviving. So when the welfare state was fully developed, then societies have started to press on environmental issues, social justice across the globe, and things like this. And so this is when the public has become really aware of these things and cared about these things, is when the companies have felt the pressure to also act in this sense. So I'm not saying at all that people didn't care about these things maybe 50 years ago, but the mass of people was not big enough, was not large enough to put the pressure on political institutions or companies so that they felt the urge to act in this sense. So this is the reason why we see it nowadays, and it's a very important thing for companies to show that they care about these things. And actually, it may be, and we'll talk about this later, maybe legitimate care or not. So maybe they really do care, maybe they don't. But actually, the pressure they feel is something relatively recent. The pressure they feel to show that they care, whether it's genuine or not. So then there's different types of engagements that companies may take when they deal with socially responsible acts and policies. So there's basically three types. Could be pure philanthropy. They could have to do with operational improvements or business model transformation. There's different ways that companies may want to engage socially. So the first one is probably the one that you would think about the fastest, the one that would come to your mind, and it's basically purely altruistic. And in this sense, it's any kind of social engagement, any kind of act that the firm decides to take, and it may be completely unrelated to the business model of the firm. So now it's time for you to hit the pause button and maybe think of one or two examples that you could think of for these kind of engagements. So, as I said, this is probably the easiest way to think about CSR. It could be just donations, so the firm gives money to civic organizations. It can donate good. It can actually urge employees to help civic organizations. It can actually urge employees to, or even launch itself, give money for educational programs, blood donation, volunteering programs, anything, or engagement with local communities, anything that has to do with engaging socially that does not necessarily be part of the business of the firm. The second type of uh, actions that the firm can take has to do with operational improvements themselves. So it has to do with kind of stuff that the firm is used to doing. So basically, the aim is to support operations across the value chain, and it's also to improve efficiency and effectiveness. That's the aim for the firm itself. But of course, the value again has to do with social responsibility and improving people's welfare or conditions at work or environmental conditions, right? So some examples you can try to think about this. And before you hit the pause button, again, this to define it in a different way, these have to do with the types of actions that are in a way intrinsic to the firm. So basically, what can the firm do to improve its operations, or not even improve, to change the way it operates so that it improves other people's or its workers or the environment, right? So it has to do with the kind of stuff that the firm is doing itself. So what can it do to change, to improve on the side? So to basically using more sort of a economic slang to reduce the negative externalities, right? So the classic example of a negative externality is that the firm pollutes. Many firms actually, when they produce, they pollute, right? So what can a firm that is socially responsible do in order to reduce pollution? So this is something that is intrinsically linked to the production of the firm, and this is the kind of CSR that firms can undertake, right? So one, as we just saw, is philanthropy, so things that may not have anything to do with the firm. The second type of things that the firm can do is actually things that are intrinsically related to the firm. So what kind of things can you think of that firms can do in order to, again, improve people's welfare, social welfare, environment? So some examples, as you can see here, have to do with sustainability initiatives that reduce resource use, waste, or emissions, which again may in turn reduce costs, right? So some examples, more precise examples, may have to do with employee working conditions, healthcare, or education, right? It not only improves their lives, of course, but it may enhance productivity, retention, or even the company reputation. And finally, the third type has to do with business model transformation. So this is sort of very linked to the one we just saw, but it implies not only changing. It basically refers to a more structural change, right? So the one we just saw refers to maybe like improving working conditions of the workers or giving them some sort of educational program, so then they have more literacy, or they kind of care about, so they give an education to their kids, so then their kids can um, can have more opportunities in the job market, and then the workers are happier, and so on and so forth. Uh, this one has to do with actually changing drastically a set of things that the firm is doing, right? So again, the aims are the usual ones, but in this case, the keywords maybe are new forms of business, right? So it's something very new. Again, it has to do with the firm's profit-making business, but in this case, it's a dramatic change in a way, right? So one example has to do, or it's been actually carried out by Unilever. So Unilever at some point, instead of using its traditional distribution chain for selling whatever goods it was selling, it decided to actually engage in empowering women. And so it sent a lot of people to train them, and it gave a lot of micro loans to women, especially in rural areas um, in India. And basically, then these women became the ones who were selling Unilever products. So, of course, in this case, it was not a purely altruistic action that Unilever was doing. It was part of its profit making decision. But what it did is it completely changed the business in the sense that instead of relying on the usual distribution change, it set up a whole program to make sure that the most disempowered people in particular areas, in this case women, were actually benefiting from the profit um, profit driven actions of the firm. And another one would be, for example, if you think about IKEA, so IKEA could, instead of for its production, instead of relying on getting resources from the given spots that they're getting now, it could set up a whole new recycling strategy to get maybe IKEA old products or even any sort of products that use the same materials that IKEA is using in order to get them and recycle them and reuse them, right? So this would be something that would be still part of the business process, but it would definitely have a major impact in terms of environment. So this is what we mean by business model transformation, right? A dramatic change in the way that business is implemented. Now, how do we measure the effectiveness of any of these programs or actions that the firm is taking? So there's two things. First, how to set it up, and then how do we assess whether it's working or not. So setting it up, basically, this is what kind of decisions should the firm um, be taking. So probably the first one will be like who will be leading this and how many people are engaged in it, right? So do we dedicate one team from the top who coordinates the whole thing, or do we let each team decide on their own business and it becomes sort of like a intersectional thing within the firm, right? So this would be the first kind of decision that the firm would have to take, and this is very important because as the Harvard Business Study that I mentioned, you'll see the reference after in the very last slide. So one of the things that mm, people who've been studying CSR have realized is that many times, and this they've realized after surveying managers from many different firms across the world, they've realized that many times actually there's a huge coordination failure within the firm, right? So it's not like they're not designing in a good, proper, coordinated way which type of action should they take. So different teams are doing different things, but even when some teams are deciding to do the same, carry out the same set of actions, it's not even easy to assess. Like different people may be doing different things, right? So probably one of the, or not probably, like surely one of the most important things that these studies on CSR have shown is that firms are kind of all over the place many times. So they definitely have good intentions, but it doesn't seem to be the case that they have a proper agenda being properly carried out. So one thing that this probably makes sense, but it's important to emphasize, is that it's a lot easier for small firms to carry out these sort of policies because there's fewer people and it's easier to coordinate. But when we talk about big multinational companies, it makes a lot of sense to have somebody at the top who is overseeing the whole thing to make sure that the policies are implemented and teams are talking to each other and it's a consistent, coherent strategy. Now, how to assess whether it's working or not? So, well, first, of course, measurement is not easy. There's some examples that we can show when it actually is measured, but some others show it's not easy to actually measure it. Right? So, for example, for philanthropy actions, it's very hard to measure it in some senses, right? So you can track the volunteer hours, but what's the impact if you have some people helping out on the ground or engaging with with the communities at the grassroots level, right? It's not easy to assess how much is that working uh, in terms of what the company is doing on the ground, but also in terms of the image. How much is the image of the company improving in the eyes of the public, right? That's not easy. Uh, for other, when you talk about operational improvements, it's easier to talk about business cost benefit analysis, and the same for business model transformation. Right, so for example, UPS, one of the things they like, it's a postal service, a good delivery service. So one of the things I did is to hire an independent auditing firm to evaluate the progress of energy use and carbon emissions, and then every year they report it, right? So this is relatively, in this case, you can quantify it, so it's relatively easy to track and to assess whether it's working or not. Now, another company, I'm sure you've seen it here, or in the US or many places you've been. So Bimbo has over 100,000 workers in Mexico, and small businesses that are relying on Bimbo for survival because they're part of sort of the big business. And what Bimbo is doing in this case is focus on social welfare. So it gives free educational services for employees and it supplies them with medical care and financial assistance. So this is a program that is catered mostly for the workers and the workers of the firms that are very closely related to Bimbo. Now, how do you assess whether it works or not? Now, can you think of one way of assessing whether these programs actually are working? And I've given you a hint a couple of slides before. So one or some ways that you can think of assessing it is basically looking at employee performance and retention, right? So if you think about it, if these programs are working, you're going to make sure that people stay there because they get better conditions either for their family, relatives, kids, or themselves, and they get better health conditions. They'll definitely want to stay because it's kind of like the outside option is worse. So one way to measure it is whether people, when you hire them, they stay in the firm, right? So retention is a key way to measure it. And of course, performance. Performance maybe not so easy to measure, but again, it's something that you can measure efficiency and you can measure hours or sick leave days or any kind of stuff like that to measure actually whether people are improving, are being more efficient in terms of what the firm is requiring. So these are two different ways that you can actually assess whether these particular programs are working. And in this case, in case you're interested, of course, maybe if you find it in the Harvard Business Studies, it's because it worked, right? So it's one good example of CSR in this case. Now, other examples, this is, we mentioned it in class, as you can see here in so the second lecture that we had together in week 3, this summarizes very briefly. These people who in Chicago, they created a company just to see whether people would be attracted to companies that are highlighting CSR, right? So they created this company called HHL Solutions, and sometimes they advertise it, emphasizing a lot the social responsibility of the firm, and sometimes they advertise it not emphasizing it. And they saw that when the emphasis was placed on CSR, the pool of applicants in general had better skills, like the CVs were stronger. And the same ones so eventually they hired a few of them in this firm that was only created for the purpose of doing research. And then they realized that once so conditional on being hired, people were more likely to work more and better when they were constantly reminded of the CSR, of the social responsibility of the firm, right? So it another way, and it's related to the Bimbo case, another way that to show that these things actually may matter for the firm and they are working well is to see the kind of people they're getting and again the kind of effort and work that they're putting. Now there's some problems and challenges that firms may be faced against when they're trying to issue and implement these sort of policies. Right, so there's a few of them. Two of them we've already seen, so alignment and coordination, and then we can also talk about risk and potential backfire. So sometimes it may not work, even if it looks like it should always work. Sometimes it's not the case. So first thing, alignment, right? So one of the things that it's usually emphasized is that it's a lot easier for the firms, or it should be the case most of the times, that the firm should set a set of goals that are consistent with its business models, right? So you can think about water production company. It need not so it's very easy for this kind of company, if it wants to be engaged socially, it's very easy to think, oh, but this firm should engage to make sure that it's environmentally friendly because it's dealing with water production. It doesn't need to ask the workers to do some volunteering or engage with the community in some sense or another, right? Because it's sort of very easy to think what's the direction that the firm can take. I'm not saying it shouldn't never do it, but it's something that for the public may be easier to understand, and for the firm, it may be a lot easier to carry out because it's part of the business. So they should have engineers who know about um, these kind of issues that the firm may want to engage in, right? So you think about a finance company, then yes, maybe a finance company may have an incentive to ask workers to volunteer or to engage with the community because it's not so clear otherwise how it may want to act, right? Or you can think about the flipped example now. If you think about sustainable development, maybe a mid-sized regional bank in a particular area and a given country need not focus on that. So instead, this mid-sized regional bank may focus on community development and working with education and financing some programs for the people who are working in the area to increase their skills and so on and so forth. Right? You think of Starbucks, you would think it's easier for Starbucks to think about reducing environmental impact of its cups and focus on organic production and fair trade and so on instead of other kind of issues that it may also totally engage in, but it's probably not as easy for it. Other things that firms may want to think about is whether it's doable. So you may think about, we talked about refugees last week, right? So you may think about, I'm the firm, I really want to take care of refugees because they have a lot of issues getting jobs, and it's probably a very good idea if you want to be socially responsible to actually hire them. Now, for a small firm, that can be very complicated. For a bigger firm, that's something that is potentially easier to be done, especially if you're a multinational firm. You're working in many different countries, and of course, different countries have different numbers of refugees, so it's easier for you to hire them in some countries other than others, right? So this is just one example, but just to think that, of course, the size of the firm really matters a lot. And then if you think about regionally, it makes sense that the firm engages in some sort of areas that the region has a deficit on, right? So if you're working in the US, you may think that it's a very good idea to, especially nowadays, to help with health insurance or similar programs to the workers. If there's no social welfare, again, the US is a good example, but some European countries also are a very good example. You may want to focus on that, so providing some sort of insurance for the workers when the state is not providing them. Or, you may want to engage in water sanitation programs when you work in a region in where that's an issue. Of course, that's not a case in Europe, but you could think if your European company is going elsewhere in the world, that's something that the company may want to engage in. Now, of course, coordination is another big challenge sometimes. So you may find that some companies have different internal managers running different programs and not talking to each other. That's not good for the company and for the image of the company, and especially because the lack of logic connecting various programs may become an issue. Now, how about risk? Again, it looks it in this case we're not really talking about backfiring, but sometimes programs may work, maybe easier to work than other ones, right? So think about now the three types of actions that the firms can take. So philanthropy, operational improvements, and the kind of business model transformation. Which ones would you think are riskier? Here's another question for you to hit the pause button. Right. So again, this sorry for flipping up back and forth. So the question again was which kind of actions could be riskier for the firm? So risky in terms of like investing money that has no returns for the firm or for society, or investing time, right? And usually, of course, this is not a very clear cut answer, but usually the riskier ones are the ones that have to do with philanthropy and business model transformation, and you can pretty much think why, right? So any kind of big business model transformation is risky in itself. So this has not to do particularly with CSR. It has to do just with transformation. Anytime that you have a drastic change in the way you do things, it's probably riskier than just keeping things as usual. It could be really good for the firm, but it's something that you're getting into the unknown. So in the unknown, you never know what's going on. And philanthropy, it's risky in the sense that again, it's not risky in the sense that the firm is gonna get something good for society. So in that sense, it's very easy to know this is gonna work. But it's risky in the sense that when the firm is doing it in a sort of cynical way, so will this have an impact on the social image that people have about the firm? Then you don't know, right? Because it may be the case that people realize that the firm is doing some good things. It may be the case that people realize that they think the firm is being sneaky, or it may be the case that people don't realize at all. So it's not really building up the image, right? And also these things are intangible and they work on the long run. So the firm needs to do a lot of programs for a very long time for it to be credible. Again, credibility is a key word here. So it's risky in that sense. It's risky in the sense that it's not, maybe risky is not the great word here, it's not the best word, but you can think about like it's not, again, it's not easy to measure. So in this sense, because it's not easy to measure, you may think that managers may be a bit against implementing these policies because they can't then show the stakeholders, the shareholders, like, oh, this is benefiting us and it's benefiting society, because you cannot really give the numbers, right? So basically, this is pretty much what I just said in the last couple of minutes. And finally, the last thing that I wanted to talk about is whether it actually may backfire. And one of the keywords in this case is moral licensing, which is sort of a technical word, but so maybe you never heard about it, maybe you heard, and maybe the word itself doesn't mean much, but the concept itself is very easy to understand, right? So basically, it refers to the fact that a positive action can be can be offset by a harmful behavior later on. So the classic example of this, not inside the firm but in real life, is like, oh, I went for a jog this morning, I went to the gym and I spent 2 hours in the gym, I feel great, and now I can have an ice cream and I can have a massive chocolate ice cream and I'm gonna feel not guilty about it because I deserve it, right? So these kind of things actually happen with the firms, and actually may happen with workers, right? So workers who are engaged in firms that carry out big programs with CSR, so really socially engaged, they may actually then not act so responsibly after they leave work because they feel they've done so well and they've done so much when they were at work that now they can sort of relax and put their feet up, right? So again, this has been studied. There's some studies that show that actually this actually happens, right? So in this sense, it may backfire because workers who are very engaged in this kind of tasks, they actually may not be behaving so well after work because they feel they've done their part. The same way that when you exercise a lot, you may just give up and drink a lot of beer or eat a huge cake or whatever. Uh, so actually, this is it's very interesting. Here, I'm going to deviate a bit, but I'm going to talk about a study that had been done many years now, 60 years ago, and talking about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation by some psychologists in the 50s. The most important one called Leon Festinger. Right. So here you have the details. You can click on later when I put the slide. So basically, the study, he basically got a few students. I'm gonna tell you why I tell you this story in just 1 minute. So he got a few students and he asked them do in this psychology study, he made them do really boring tasks. So if you click on the links later, you will see one video in which you see the tasks that the students are doing, and they're really tedious and boring for 1 hour. And then to some students, he was giving them $1. To some students, he was giving them $20. But that's again in 1957. So you can think of it as like to some students nowadays, they would probably be given $20, and the other ones were given $400. So after the boring hour that they have spent, of course, he asked them many questions, but one of the questions was how boring or how much would you recommend this to anyone else, or how boring did you feel the task was? And very interestingly, the people, the students who had been paid a lot of money, they reported they were completely and utterly bored. Like no problem telling the psychologist that they had been bored for 1 hour doing that. Now the people who had gotten less money, so $1 only, they were reporting that actually it was not so boring. And what's the key takeaway from this is that, so what Festinger in this case suggested, and many studies later have sort of confirmed or have gone in the same direction, is that the lack of motivation to do the task for the people who didn't get a lot of money sort of forced themselves to think it was fun. So the people who were doing it for a lot of money, they just knew they were wasting their time, but they were getting a lot of money afterwards, so it was worth it. Now the people who were doing it for not so much money, they really felt they were completely wasting their time, and they had absolutely not a good excuse for it because they were not going to get any money. So they convinced, during that hour that they spent doing this thing, they convinced themselves that it was not as boring actually, and it was sort of fun or engaging or whatever. Right? So these, and of course, as I said, right, it's been done many times, and it's always like results are usually very consistent with this. So it talks one thing, of course, about the interesting itself is that it talks about how powerful our minds can be. But now going back to the topic that I was mentioning, again, in this sense, it talks about how well workers may behave once they have workers or even consumers, right? If you buy a good from a company because you know that the company is giving money to some NGO, then but you're not really persuaded to act in this way. You just do it sort of for the donation of the money as a consumer. Then you may feel like you can do anything you want later and behave as you want, and very similar for workers, right? So if they're very intrinsically motivated to work on the kind of line socially that the firm is doing, then they won't give up once they leave the job or they quit the job, right? But if all the socially responsible actions they're doing is because they're getting money from the firm, but they're not fully motivated by it. In this sense, if workers only have the extrinsic motivation, so when they get out of work, they may just not behave as well, right? So in this case, it's sort of tricky for the firm to really know how actually their workers are motivated, because it may actually have an effect on how much effort they're going to put afterwards in keeping up with what the firm is trying to work on. And so then other kind of reasons why this CSR may backfire is because sometimes people may think they're not credible, they're not authentic, right? So hotels cite environmental concerns for not changing towels, but people may think, so customers may think that it's because the motivation is to save on housekeeping costs, right? So this reduces the credibility of the hotel, and maybe some people may think, no, I'm going to make sure that you don't save on that. I'm going to make sure that you wash my towels every single day, even if I didn't want to. Or you can think of any sort of brand or any company that gives whatever it's producing to certain groups of people, and it sort of tells everyone that it's doing for a good thing, but you may think they're doing it for marketing purposes or for a particular strategic vision. And again, it may backfire because the image of the firm can be hurt. Or if the firm creates a factory in a given country saying that it's to actually help develop the country socially and economically, but some people do realize or may think that it's doing it because they get subsidies or they're not going to pay taxes, or so any kind of economic reason that is going to increase the profit of the firm, then again it may backfire, right? So credibility, in as in most cases, or most dimensions of the firm's action, is key also in this case, right? So let me just give a couple of remarks to summarize this. So CSR is a strategy that appears at the end of the century, mostly because of I wouldn't say change of values in society, but I would say an evolution of values towards a particular set of values that really care about social responsible production. There's different alternatives. There's different ways, of course, that firms can engage socially, and it really depends on the size and scope of the firm, the business sectors they're in, and the type of consumers that they have. Right, and the very last slide that I have after this summarizes the key steps that the Harvard Business School study that I mentioned at the very end suggests for any firm that would want to engage in social responsible actions. Right, so the first one is to align the programs to the business model. So as I said a couple of times already in this video, it's a lot easier for the firm to engage in some sort of programs in which it has expertise. So that makes sense. So again, fast food operator will be better served by a program that collects excess food from a supply chain partner and gives it to some people who need it around, right? So this kind of fast food operator may as well carry out these kind of actions instead of suggesting employees to donate blood. We can have other kind of firms having this kind of blood donation programs. Of course, second key step is to develop metrics to assess performance, because you want to know whether what you're doing is worth or not. Third thing is to coordinate programs across types. So it doesn't mean that you cannot do different things, but it means that the firm, like whatever kind of things the firm is doing, they should be consistent altogether. It shouldn't look like it's all over the place. It should look like it's a coordinated, very well thought of set of actions that the firm is carrying out. And the fourth point they suggest, or the fourth step they suggest, is to make sure that it's coordinated from the top. So it's like a fully developed strategy that everyone is sort of implementing in similar ways. So there's no inconsistencies throughout different teams. Right, and the last point that they do not mention, but I do mention, and other studies mention, is that it's maybe the more cynical point, but it's marketing in the sense that it's, of course, many firms do care, and many firms responsible and leaders do care about these things, but it's also, since the firm is doing it, it's also good for them to actually promote and show everyone that they're doing these things. Right, so here you have the references and a few links in case you want to check them, and that's all for me today. Oh,